All right. Call this May 16th, 2019 Planning Commission meeting to order. We're here in Council Chambers in Sammamish City Hall. Let's start out this evening with roll call for the commission. Start on my left.
Mark Lewis.
Roshina Farrell.
Eric Brooks.
Rituja Indapure.
Larry Crandall.
Great. Thank you. Everybody's present and accounted for. Next, approval of the agenda for this evening. Does anyone have any comments or objections to approving the agenda for this evening? Okay, by unanimous consent, the agenda is approved. Next, the meeting minutes from our May 2nd meeting. Anyone have any comments on our May 2nd meeting minutes?
I do have a question. Mark Cross had a public comment and he was referencing some papers, and I believe he handed it over to staff. I was wondering if a copy might be available for at least me.
Absolutely, I can get a copy of that and email it to you.
Perfect, thank you.
Does anyone else
Why
want
don't
a
you go
copy?
ahead, just email it to everybody.
Sure, I can definitely do that.
Great, thank you. Anything else on the meeting minutes from last time? Okay, by unanimous consent, we'll call the meeting minutes from last meeting approved. Next is public comment on non-agenda items. So this evening's agenda item is the Urban Forest Management Plan. So if you'd like to speak on anything other than the Urban Forest Management Plan, now would be the time. Does anyone want to give non-agenda public comment? Great. Nobody on non-agenda public comment. So let's move on to our old business, which is our agenda item for this evening, which is an update and discussion about the pending, upcoming Urban Forest Management Plan. It appears that Jeff has something he wants to start out with.
I'm actually going to kick that presentation off this evening, Chair. So, well, good evening, Planning Commission. Jeff Thomas with Community Development. Before we get started, while we're queuing up the presentation here on the screen, I think, I'd like to introduce our folks over at the staff table. Kelly Hildy, our planning manager, of course, you know her, and Ian Scott. Some of you may be seeing him for the first time. He's our leading our consultant effort on this urban forest management plan. He's with the Davie Resource Group, and they've been working with us, I think for about a year, maybe a little over a year now on this effort. So the presentation for this evening is going to be, I think, in more or less 3 parts. I'm going to take you through some introductory slides and then turn it over to Ian to talk about how we got to the draft plan that's in your packet. And then I believe Kelly is going to walk you through a summary of the goals and objectives that are contained in the plan. And we should have plenty of time after our presentation to take your questions, have some discussion, whatever you'd like to do. So with that, do you want me to run my own slides, or? Yes, you would like me to run my own slides. Okay, there we go. So already out of sequence here. I covered this slide already, what we're going to walk you through. And of course, we'll talk about next steps, the rest of the process in regards to the plan itself over the next few months with the Planning Commission. Okay, so backing all the way up to the year 2015. 2015 was the last time the city completed a major update to its comprehensive plan. And at the time, the Planning Commission in 2015, as well as the City Council, trees, removal of trees, preservation of trees were a very hot topic in 2015. The City Council, on the advice of the Planning Commission, included some language in our comprehensive plan at that time, providing a goal, a broader goal, and then a more specific policy regarding the completion of an urban forest management plan. So you can see it there on the screen. Policy EC 1010 fits under goal EC 10, and that was where the directive was initiated for us to begin scoping out this effort. The council doing a budget appropriation to fund this effort and to get working on it. So. Okay, what I'm going to talk about over the next short series of slides a little bit, I'm going to bounce a little bit between some generalities, and then relating them specifically to this planning effort, but other planning efforts we're going to be doing moving forward into the future on future work programs. What you see here is a pyramid of sorts. Kelly and I have spent a lot of time in recent weeks as we've reflected back on some other efforts, including that major comp plan update from 2015, about how do we get our arms and our brains wrapped around this body of work, and how can we bring some consistency to the different planning efforts that we go through. Even though the subject matter is different in different cases, they all have some common structural elements. So what we have come up with through looking at other examples and doing some original brainstorming, this diagram, as simple as it may seem, really does represent what we're trying to accomplish. When we get some directive like that comp plan goal and policy that I just showed you, and we start working on an effort, we have to formulate a vision for it. In this specific case, you can see it references the urban forest management plan there on the screen. But then we've got to go about the planning effort and develop the goals and then the underlying objectives, how to implement those goals in a broad sense, right? That's what this effort is about starting tonight, is really focusing on the goals and the objectives. We go through that portion of the planning process, but then we've got to do something with it. There's nothing worse than having a plan that we all put a lot of energy, time, and effort and expense into, and then we move it through, it gets legislative approval, and then we just tuck it nicely on the shelf up above Kelly's desk and say, oh, okay, hey, good job, guys, let's move on to the next thing, right? That's not why we're in the business doing this. We're in the business of doing those plans and actually implementing those plans to make real change, to build community, and to do all the great things that those plans set out to do. So that's great. We go and we do those things. Often those will require money, staff time, other community resources to be able to achieve some of those implementation measures that we formulate at the planning process. But we've also got to take one final additional step, and that's to measure, how did we do? What do we need to do better? Do we actually need to go back, and do we need to make some improvements? So this diagram, I hope we're able to bring to you in not different forms, but in different fashions with different subject matter over time, and we're bringing it to you for the first time tonight with this effort here. Now, to talk about urban forestry specifically, this is where we're at 2018, 2019, right? We're focusing on the goals and the objectives. That's what we've been up to for the last year plus, is doing all that public outreach, community outreach, taking all those inputs and forming them into this draft planning document that has these goals and objectives. So you can see over there on the left-hand side of the screen, those 4 bullets, that's what a lot of time and effort has went into since the beginning of 2018 when we started working with Ian and his group. Okay. This is just a quick recap, kind of showing that a slightly different way. You can see some of the, little bit better, some of the specifics on what went on at different points in time. We also engaged with the UW as well to help us with that canopy assessment that occurred as a result of some other factors going on outside of this specific effort, but they all kind of came together, and UW's work also fed into what we've got for you tonight, presenting to you in draft form. So we went through a whole bunch of community engagement, got to the draft review. We've had a few check-ins with you, as well as the Parks Commission, as well as the City Council, on some of the different elements that went into building the draft that's in your packet. And then, of course, here in 2019, we're going to move through the legislative process. Oh yeah, so back to this before I get to my other diagram I want to show you. So then once we get that done, hopefully in 2019, and we get that final legislative review complete with the City Council on the plan with the goals and the objectives, we're going to move in 2020 then into the bottom of the pyramid, and then talking about how do we implement those objectives and how do we measure those, right? So we'll be back to talk to you, same subject, but an extension of that, about potential actions, ranking those actions, what they're going to cost, what kind of timeline it will take to achieve them, and then who's going to be responsible for them. Okay, This was the other graphic I wanted to show you. So again, we're going to talk a little bit general about this, and then we'll relate it back to urban forestry. The continuous improvement cycle. This comes in various names and different formats and so forth, but continuous improvement is something we've really started focusing on in not only the community development department here at City Hall, but in our public works department and parks departments with all of our interdepartmental friends. And it's really trying to take some of our processes and make improvements upon them, right? So plan, do, check, act. In this cycle, and Kelly and I debated where the little arrow in the center of that, how that should be situated. It really starts at plan. That's where we're at now, right? The do, implementing the plan in 2020, the check, and then the action. The action could involve going back and actually improving what we've already done. So it becomes a cycle that repeats itself over time, right? So we've got the pyramid, how you get the initial thing done, but then you've got this cycle where we're going to go and hopefully over time implement different things and improve on what we've already accomplished. Relating this back to urban forestry, you can see here, by the time we complete that cycle, it could be a 5 to 10 year period where we've got a next generation of planning commissioners and maybe even a next generation of staff and citizens that will come back and wanting to take another crack at that to say, that's great, we've accomplished lots during this initial urban forestry planning and implementation and measurement period, but now we need to update that and continue to be futuristic and look ahead to see what else we need to do. So with that, hopefully that sets a little bit of the table as to where we're at this evening, where we're going to go, and what we hope to accomplish. This is a big subject. And a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of community input has went into this so far. You're going to have the opportunity starting this evening to digest some of this and really hone in on those goals and objectives that you want to forward to City Council at some point here, probably July-ish, and to have Council give final consideration to this year so that we can set up then the implementation and the measurement phases of this effort in 2020. So with that, Ian, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I think you've got the ability to change your own slides at the table there.
Yes.
And we'll get into the how-tos and then the actual subject material with Kelly. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Okay, so, can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, there we go. I just got to lean in on it. So my role here tonight is to guide you through the Urban Forest Management Plan. It's lengthy, it's comprehensive, and there's a lot of details in there. And you know, to be able to get your mind around the goals in the plan, we thought it would be important to at least walk through a little bit of it at the highest levels. And we've kind of done this before at a previous meeting. But the purpose behind the plan is, again, to provide a policy guide for managing and enhancing and growing trees in the city of Sammamish. We put up 2 key points that, you know, the plan is helped to illustrate the benefits of trees to the city and promote a shared vision and collaboration for care of the urban forest. There's more on the next slide, but these are the 2 kind of fundamental pieces that make the benefit of the urban forest management plan. With those, that you get into being able to, you know, create that framework for how to manage this you know, the entire urban forest by establishing some benchmarks and getting on a path to ensure that the health and sustainability of the urban forest exists and continues to exist. And doing even better than that, as a model of continuous improvement, we hope to be able to increase the benefits that are provided to Sammamish and the region by the urban forest here, and make for certain that the resources are in place for the care and management of the community trees. When we look at what we have through this project here, we took a high-level view of the forest, got a canopy assessment, so we know that we have some 40, was it 40% tree canopy? I can't, 48. The city of Sammamish has more canopy than most other neighboring cities. The Issaquah, it could be debated at this point because of the age of their last assessment. That's an important benchmark or performance indicator of what you have and where you could go with it. You can break that down, and we did through this process. We looked at canopy fragmentation and areas where there's perhaps planting opportunities. Going forward into implementation, one of the key points of managing an urban forest is getting a planting plan in place. And using this information, the city will be able to make some strategic decisions on where to get trees in the ground and where to get the most value out of those trees. Another key, so besides looking at just the urban forest and the trees that the city has, the urban forest management plan has to take a look at the way the city is organized to manage the urban forest, and that's another point that's a hurdle for every city to work through. As you have community development engaged with trees, you have public works that engages with trees, and you have parks and rec, and and of course private citizens. So how do we engage all these different groups? Well, in this plan, we outline what the current operating practices are so that everybody can understand how the city is structured to manage the urban forest. And we've set goals that help migrate that towards a change that maximizes the city's effectiveness and efficiency and even the safety around care of trees in the city. The other part of the plan that we look at is recognizing that the community is here to help. It's not just city staff that manages the urban forest. There's private property owners, and there are a dearth of nonprofit agencies at various levels who the city would tap to engage and involve in the care of the urban forest. So anywhere from FutureWise and MRSC, the Municipal Research and Services Center, those are kind of a high level groups. But locally even we talk to people like at the Sammamish Native Plant Stewards who are actively engaged in planting trees and will participate in this plan. The other way to make sure that this plan is effective is to engage the community, because it really is meant for the benefit of the community. We engaged the community through, primarily through stakeholder interviews, and this is where, again, like Sammamish Stormwater Stewards, city staff, members of the Planning Commission, we sat down with them individually and ran through a series of questions to kind of explore what everybody's different visions for the forest could be. And from that information, we took it out to community workshops. We held one right here in these chambers to, again, get more feedback on what's working right now, what isn't working, where do people want to go, because with trees, it takes a long time to make change. I think Larry, just briefly at the very beginning of this, before this presentation, we were talking about how when was the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago, right? That's the thing. But it only takes a day with a chainsaw to cut it down. So, community workshops, get everybody engaged about what's important to the community. From there, we took the results of those to commission and council for input. We had some initial sessions with you folks to talk about essentially the stuff that we've learned so far, and help make sure that everybody understands kind of where we're going and the path that follows. We had some educational pop-ups at farmers markets and solicited some feedback there, which through those we were able to develop a community survey. The community survey, I think, even though like a lot of people will argue, well, statistically maybe we didn't get enough, full representation, or the only people that are interested were really people that are either impassioned about the urban forest. But what it does inside this plan is it sets some benchmark questions to help measure success in the long term. And with that, I'll turn it back to Kelly, who now we can really get into the goals and objectives of the plan.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. So as previously mentioned, the purpose of tonight's discussion is to focus on the goals and objectives, which will help drive the future implementation of the Urban Forest Management Plan, and to ask the Planning Commission, do these goals and objectives adequately address the threats and opportunities facing Sammamish's urban forest resource? And that is the wrong mouse.
Would that be easier?
That's not going to do us any good. Okay, so yeah, I can click through that.
Okay.
Perfect. So the Urban Forest Management Plan goals and objectives are divided into 3 separate buckets: urban forest sustainability, municipal operations, and community collaboration and engagement. Urban forest sustainability is those associated goals are intended to improve the urban forest resource over the next 20 years by developing detailed expectations for the urban forest. The municipal operations, these goals are intended to drive improvements in city policy, practices, by improving efficiencies and alignments of efforts within city departments. And last is the community collaboration and engagement goals. These goals build stronger community engagement and public participation in urban forest stewardship. There we go. So I'll start off by reading through each of the goals and give a very brief synopsis of the related objectives. Afterwards, I'll ask for any questions, your feedback, before we move on to the next slide and repeat the same process. I also want to point out that on the side panel there that we have some community feedback highlights, and these are included on each slide. This is a reminder of what we've heard from our community and our stakeholder groups. This feedback, along with all of the what do we have, the bulk of that plan information, is what influenced the development of these goals and policies. So again, as we're reading through all of those 55 pages and the feedback, we want to keep that in the back of our mind as we're reviewing these, and also because this sets the stage for that next phase, which is the implementation strategies. So we're going to start off with urban forest sustainability. Goal 1, maintain overall canopy cover. Objectives include establishing an overall canopy goal, enhancing the urban canopy in key areas, and assessing and evaluating the canopy every 10 years for any changes. Goal 2, increase and promote resilience in the urban forest. Objectives include developing a citywide planting plan, approval of a tree list as a separate policy document, pest management program, and recommendations that address defensive space around homes and neighborhoods, fuel loading, and selective tree thinning along right-of-ways. And the third goal up here is update design, construction, and development standards that apply to trees and planting sites. So these objectives include requiring compliance with the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, for tree care, develop design standards with specific requirements for planting around existing infrastructure, and establishing tree inspections and audit requirements for development projects. So with that, are there any questions? Any feedback?
I think I'd send this feedback via email. I think, one of the slides that Jeff presented earlier, one of the circles took us back to assessment, saying, how are we doing with our policies? So I would like us to add that because, UA3 talks about updating design and updating standards and documentation. And if we could add assessment also a part of this to say, how are we assessing our development guidelines and do they need to be tweaked, when we revisit this plan? So I would like to see that added. Also, I think, and I don't know where this would go, But I would also like us to understand what would be the enforcement mechanisms, especially when we come up with new development standards. So how would that get enforced? And then also, I think one thing that is important is, education is a big part of all our goals. And how do we educate either private citizens or whoever is coming in? Can this process, or can we add the urban forest plan to when we're doing pre-application, for example, pre-application before permitting? How can we educate the developers or citizens or whoever comes into our community about our plan? So if we could add that, that'll be great. Thank you.
I just wanted to quickly, I think, and maybe help me on this, because we trying to look at focus on the goals and things, but won't our tree retention rules and regulations or policies, codes, won't that take care of your second question of how to, the enforcement thing? I think, isn't that spelled out in the?
Yes, actually it is, and that's on some upcoming slides.
Okay.
So we're going to get there. I don't want to give away the
Well,
ending. But
sorry.
a lot of this feedback is fantastic because I think we already have the answers.
And the other one, excuse me, isn't number C up there, take care of your assessment question? Well, no, yeah, UA1C.
But I think that is very specific to the tree canopy. And what I wanted us to assess was the guidelines. And, do we need to tweak our guidelines?
Great. That's good feedback.
I had three things. Some of these are probably, and some of my comments will be about the implementation, just some things that I would like to see part of the implementation. So very top there, A, develop and adopt an overall canopy goal. I think it's really important that we make sure that our canopy goal is practical and realistic. Setting goals that seem unrealistic tends to make people turn off everything else they see in the plan. So I think we just need to make sure that when we develop some number or some metrics around that, it should be justifiable. The next question is in that same one, number 1C. I guess I don't understand necessarily what assess involves, and I'm wondering how 10 years came into play, only because that feels like a long time. But if it's a deep assessment, then maybe that's appropriate. And maybe that's just a little bit of follow-up to kind of make sure that it makes sense that 10 years is the right, a lot happens in 10 years. And I want to make sure that when we talk about some of these time periods and these numbers, if this is the establishment of a plan, sometimes those numbers never get revisited for a long time, and we fall into the trap of doing what was written down someplace without a lot of thought. So that one I think should be a little bit of a
Yeah,
thought.
if I can comment just a little bit on that, the every 10 years is just something that's emerged as fairly common amongst cities around the country. You could do it more frequently, but you may not see the change, like the margin of error. If you repeated this exercise next year, you may not the cost versus the benefit doesn't typically weigh out. But every 10 years tends to be the point where there's been enough change in the city that everybody wants to see kind of where they're at. In the interim, some of the strategies involve, permit process to see how much land use has changed, and so the city can get some interim information about how change is happening, and that's an option.
Yeah, I think that is one thing about Sammamish that right now is a bit different in that there's been a lot of change in a more rapid fashion than in many other places. So,
Yeah.
but maybe 10 years is the right
Yeah,
number.
certainly a 5-year objective, it can be done. It just may not be as valuable, and that's where you get into the implementation plan and you just start
Exactly.
assessing the value.
The one other comment on this page is, it kind of goes along with number 2C, Integrated Pest Management Program. It seems that if resilience is on the list, then disease management ought to be in there as well. And I can't recall, maybe that's someplace else, but it feels like it fits here, particularly when we're talking about things like laminated root rot or any kind of disease that can spread quickly through the canopy. So I think that probably should be a part of this or someplace else in a way that makes sense.
Yeah. Typically, the expression of IPM includes disease and pests. I think pest to me seems to be an easier catchphrase or catchword.
Okay.
I just had a few comments. I really like in goal UA1, the develop and adopt an overall canopy goal. Reading through the plan, and it seems to kind of imply that, you know, our stretch goal will be a 60% canopy in the city, and I think, you know, it would be really nice to kind of get that goal down there. Because I liked, as you went through the plan, there was a comment, it was the consensus was clear, and it was a quote from somebody: protect and conserve as much of the urban forest as reasonably possible. And I think that's an overarching sentiment from our residents of the city. So I know reaching a 60% canopy goal is going to be, you know, a gargantuan goal, and considering that we're already ahead of all of our neighbouring cities anyway, but I think raising the standard, I think that's what our citizens really want. And I think maybe if 60% is a stretch, but I think we should try to get as close to that, because even looking at some of the numbers, and we've got a 40% canopy goal right now, but looking at the amount of acreage that is under private ownership, and even if we reach the number of acres that we lay out on the plan and we manage to maintain that canopy goal, we can even fall below our 40%, or we get to maybe 45 maybe. So we have a lot of work to do, I think, in terms of reaching out to the part of our urban forest that's in private hands and educating those owners on how to maintain those trees. Also, how do we partner with landowners when they want to develop their land, as they're entitled to do? And how can we use that 35% tree retention policy that we already have on the books, and how can we use that better to maintain a wider canopy on that development site, allowing the landowner to develop the site the way they want, but also ensuring those goals that the greater citizens want. We want to keep our trees. And I think that's where this plan is going to conflict with other residents' objectives, is that they want to develop their land, but we also want to maintain our trees. And so that if we can work with that 35% tree retention policy that we have right now, and the fact that that may need to be tweaked so that it's more about retaining the canopy going forward. But those were kind of the things that stood out to me as I read the plan. I love the plan. I love the photographs. I particularly like the little slug who's trying to get across the pebbles. That was one of my favorite photographs. And I found it easy to read. Oftentimes these plans are not easy read. So I think our residents will find it an easy plan to read and consume and get through the information. But I think as we go forward and we go through implementation and setting those goals, is kind of where, in trying to get to that extended canopy goal, which I think most of us want, how do we also ensure that people, when they go to develop those last remaining acres that are up for development and probably will be developed, how can we encourage them to keep as many of those trees as we need?
I have a question. I'm obviously new to this, so I wasn't here for all the iterations of this, and I tried to go back and view some of the items. I kind of want a little clarification on what exactly makes this a plan. When I think of a plan, I think of something that you can look at and then execute. And in this document these are items we can do, this is where we are, this is where we could be, but in no place did it seem like a 60% canopy goal. It was our goal, it was just like we could theoretically get there. So as I'm looking at this, how should I interpret the word plan as it relates to this document?
Sure. If you start, and I'll
Yeah, as Jeff mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, really think about this as kind of the phase one of the plan. This is where we're doing all our research, our analysis, we're hearing from the community and what they want, and we are summarizing that in that phase one of the plan. Where it goes from there is the implementation strategies and developing those implementation strategies, and you can think about that as the phase two. And both of those together is a plan. It has all the information that you need If anyone would like to go back and read that information specifically, it's there, the references and the resources. But that plan becomes implementable with those actions, those very specific actions, like let's have a discussion about setting a tree canopy percentage goal, and then how do we get there? And that becomes that second phase. So that is your plan. Would you like to?
Yeah, no, that's essentially where I was going to go. I was thinking more on the practical level is from day to day, the city staff, whether they're in Public Works or Parks Department, you want to make sure that they're doing things that align with the greater community vision, and the plan provides them that backbone support to say, okay, well, we're planting trees to honor and achieve the canopy goal objectives. When a citizen comes forward and says I want to give back to the community, I want to plant a tree. Right now, it's very difficult for the city to say, oh, well, we know exactly where it needs to go. A plan like this provides that, even at that simplest level, the guidance so that everything is effectiveness is maximized.
Okay, and I have one more thing. I understand you guys realize that wasn't a scientific survey you did, and I get that. But one of the challenges I have with the questions is it didn't measure the value of trees against other important values that the citizens may have. It was just, are trees good? And everyone agreed they were. That's one of the reasons we bought our properties, because it was like a little park. So it would be helpful, I think, in determining what our actual objectives are if we knew how people might measure a tree versus something else, another value they might have as a family or a community. Because right now we're not measuring it against anything else. So that's my only other comment.
I just wanted to reiterate what Commissioner Boffman said about the every 10 years. I think, in Sammamish we've seen a lot of change. But what I'm hoping is that I think somewhere in there is a provision for an annual report that can be produced. And I'm hoping we have some action items that we derive out of this whole plan where we say, hey, we want to visit these action items every year and see how we are performing against that. So I think that probably is going to be useful for us to at least to know which direction we're going in. So thank you.
I think that's a great idea, and I hope it's on my next slide. Okay. Would we like to, any other questions, or can I?
I just had I wasn't sure I understood your comment, Josh. When you meant measuring trees against something else, I wasn't sure what the something else was. So can you help me understand?
Could be cost of the additional regulation or additional travel time by increasing the number of trees in a median, or anything like that might, I don't know what they could be, and I haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about what those competing interests could be. But if you add additional regulations, there's somebody that's impacted by it, whether it's the ability, like we've got a public comment here about somebody who has dead trees and the inability to take care of them in their yard. So that is exactly what I'm talking about being able to measure against other values that members of the community might have. That's what I mean. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, and I think there's a really good opportunity too, when we start talking about some of these other goals and objectives, to still keep that in mind as a potential implementation strategy that we need to do further survey of the community to ask, the value of the tree versus other values that are important to you. I think that becomes a more specific survey to help support, say, a review of our regulations. So may not have been captured in this phase, but it doesn't mean it can't be captured in the implementation strategies as a potential action. So, okay, I am going to move on because we do have 6 of these slides to get through. Okay, am I on? There we go. Okay, so still with urban forest sustainability goals and objectives. Number 4, establish a tree bank fund for applications beyond parks. So these are objectives include considering a tree in lieu fund, allocating funds for tree care operations, and identifying opportunities for additional sources of revenue. 5, assess the ecosystem services provided by public trees and natural areas to establish additional matrix for management. Objectives include completing a resource analysis, reviewing changes and improvements to the benefits, composition, and benefit versus investment ratio, and developing an annual State of the Urban Forest report. See, I promised you it was coming up. 6, collect and maintain a complete inventory database for the community tree resource. Objectives include developing a standard tree inspection protocol, integrating inventory data into a management system, and assigning responsibility for keeping inventory data current. And the last goal under urban forest sustainability is care for the community urban forests using the best available science. Objectives include setting policies to ensure compliance with ANSI, tree care and safety standards, as well as consider BMPs for urban forest work that is advised by the International Society of Arboriculture. Questions?
I just have a comment. I just love that idea of the State of the Urban Forest report that will come out annually. I thought that was a great idea. Made me smile when I read it. And just the only comment that I have about it is that when we come to write those annual reports, I loved in the introduction that it's on page 14 of the packet, when they, in the report, you clearly define environmental benefits like water quality, carbon sequestration, and energy savings, that if those are also mentioned in that annual report so that we kind of link it back to those key notions in the report. I think in this era of climate change, and everybody is ever more educated in carbon emissions and doing all that great work, because that, and kind of back to the point that was made about how can you value a tree up against other things when you can relate it back to environmental benefits, that this is one of the reasons we do these things with trees, because it does all kinds of things for energy saving. It helps with carbon emissions. It helps with the water quality and stormwater. And especially when we live up here in a plateau, stormwater is everything. So I think when we come to write that report, that annual State of the Urban Forest report, if we can relate back all of our progress and all of our future endeavours to a lot of those issues, I think that would also help to explain to people this is why we are spending money doing this, spending time doing this, because it's for the greater community benefit.
Thank you.
I wanted to see, if we have some guidelines or policies around historical trees, and if we have an inventory of heritage trees in the city. I think that is something that is important. I was at a HOA meeting recently, and they were talking about the tree, which was almost 150 years old, and now there was going to be a utility that was going through that, and they had to, that was going to cause some damage to the tree. So I think it would be great to have that perspective as well. As can we identify those trees? Can we have a plan? Can we highlight those kind of trees? And that goes, along with the inventory of the database of the trees that we have. I think also highlighting some trees that are very native to the plateau. I think that might be great. And then underneath, I think, I don't know again where this will go, but also can we have some guidance or guidelines around what happens when a utility, for example, a sewer or electricity, gas, when they have to go under and, when they touch the trees, what does it do to them, and what kind of guidelines be given to them when maintenance of trees is going on?
To clarify that one, that's a goal UA7, even though it just briefly references ANSI A300 and the safety standards. Both of those set that framework for how to approach a tree for trenching or pruning, to move into the tree space and get your physical infrastructure in there. And currently, under city, the city staff that we talked to, they recognize that these things were out there and they reference them, but it's not in a formal place inside the city. And that's what we're saying, is it needs to be a formal recognition. And a lot of cities will develop it themselves. And then they fall behind. And ANSI is a national standards institute, so they're working to keep it up to date. So in that sense, the city doesn't have to. They just say, hey, as long as you're following ANSI, we can get behind you on your whatever it is that you're proposing to do.
I would just add, because it's very much related, that I'm not familiar with ANSI A300, but I do think that, having had actually the experience with this in the city, there are often times with utilities choices between cut the trees down and dig a trench through and do some directional boring or do a bunch of different alternatives. But those alternatives cost more money. And so figuring out how to encourage making choices that help maintain the tree canopy without hitting them over the head with too big of a club that they have to do things that then are detrimental from a cost standpoint, that's an important thing to find some balance on. And it actually is real meat that you can get into, where ANSI A300 probably doesn't deal with that. It probably says you could do this or you could do that. Right. But encouraging people to make choices that are helpful, and I'm not sure how to accomplish that, but it should be perhaps part of the implementation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'll probably take a cough drop in a while, so it's good I get all this out, then you're rooting for the cough drop sooner. It's so great to sit here and listen to the fellow, I think that's not gender, council members say things. And one of the things came up when HOA came. I just recently had a conversation with an individual who is now a member of an HOA Board of Representatives, Homeowners Association Board of Representatives. And he said when he first came, he didn't like the rules and regulations and didn't even care about them, and he'd do what he wanted. But he learned, studied, and he said, now I support them, and I think making good rules and regulations are great. And now, going to, use the term Josh, it's easier. I liked what he was talking about comparison, but then somebody else came up with balance. We need the balance. And one of the things came to my mind, because I guess we're here liking trees, in safety and security, the law enforcement and even neighborhoods want to be careful of the balance between a good healthy tree that gives good oxygen out in the world and keeps the water there, and good vision. So I like that. And the last thing, I think it's in our other notes, but this is going to be on a dashboard soon, all this, and I think that will help us. So probably we need a class in what dashboard is, and to train the community how to go online and look and see what are our achievements. Okay, thank you.
I would be interested in, on UA number 6 on the database, and it specifies public trees, but it might be interesting to allow people to voluntarily have private trees part of that database. I know I probably would. I don't know if they have RFID or something and they can check them out as they drive down the street. I don't know exactly what that means, but there could be a significant amount of the community that would partake
and some of
in that.
points to the notion of a historic tree registry as well, to voluntarily say this tree in my yard is of certain status and get it added to the inventory. We proposed adding an inventory as primarily a way for the city to manage its liabilities around the trees. So it's important for a city to have an inventory. It takes ownership of 15,000 right-of-way trees. Is the initial estimate, and you have no real inspection records for those trees. So it's mostly a liability, but certainly it's an added educational component.
My one comment actually was about this particular item, and just that I would want to advocate that we be thoughtful in collecting data, because when it says a complete inventory database, a couple things can happen. We can fill up servers with data that nobody ever looks at or uses. or it becomes so much stuff then we're spending more money collecting data that we're not actually using because it's a blind. In other words, I would want to make sure to encourage that we are thoughtful, that the money we spend to collect data results in data that we actually use to do something, and not just blindly collect data that even if it's valuable, but if we never use it, there's not much use to our community in spending those dollars.
I would hope that the city would be able to come back with the best management practices for tree inventories, which is a publication by the International Society of Arboriculture that outlines the most important attributes to collect. But yeah, I've seen that lots of times where, there's a lot of data fields that just aren't relevant to anybody. Nothing actionable in them. So it's a good point.
Okay, great. Well, now on to municipal operations, goals and objectives. We'll start with number 1 here. Maintain urban forest management plan alignment with other city plans and policies. Objectives include reviewing, revising the plan every 5 years, establishing a risk management policy, coordinating with emergency response plans, and developing wildfire prevention plans. 2, ensure that staff are appropriately trained to work safely and effectively. Objectives include formalizing or establishing policies for ongoing staff training, supervision of tree work by an ISA-certified arborist, and requiring all tree work to comply with safety standards. 3, establish a formal interdepartmental working team. The objective here is to designate an urban forester within the city staff to provide leadership to the working team. And 4, develop annual work plans for routine operations and predictable budgets. Objectives include setting operational objectives and developing an annual urban forestry operation budget.
Anyone?
I just wondered, and I'd mentioned, our 35% tree retention policy. Is that, I didn't see it formally stated in here in the municipal operations goals. Should it be mentioned in here? Is it mentioned further on? Because obviously they interconnect, obviously, on the same subject. Because it's mentioned somewhere in the plan about the follow-up to, are people following our rules? When we talk about the 35% tree retention, is that really happening, and how is that happening? And I know we'll probably get into that during implementation. But I think that's a really important thing. It's great. It would be even great if we decided to set that 60% tree canopy goal. But how are we following up on that? How are we going to make sure that it's been followed through on? But we do have something on the books right now, which is the 35% tree retention policy, and are we following up on that, and do we know, is that really happening? And if it is, but we still don't like what's happening, and it still looks like we're losing a lot of trees, and I don't really like how the 35% tree retention policy looks like when we develop a piece of land. Maybe we need to tweak that. Maybe we need to kind of inform that, and will this plan help us with that? So is that somehow mentioned further in here, Kelly?
At a higher level, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That will be the next slide.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted some clarification on what is meant by the emergency response plan.
Sure. I think one of the first outcomes of looking into urban forestry is there's certain right-of-ways that in the city that are maybe higher priority for emergency situations, and as the city breaks down the great big elephant of how many trees do they have to care for, and where do they start inspecting, having conversations with emergency management personnel to make sure that the trees that are might be predisposed to fall over in a high wind event aren't going to fall right in major thoroughfares. So those trees should be higher prioritized. So it's making sure that the city has those as part of the plan, a relationship going with emergency response personnel. Often we'll take a tree inventory or a canopy study and overlay the roads and the utility corridors, say, for electric utilities, and make sure that those are getting the highest priority attention to make sure that, again, that the community stays safe in the event of an emergency.
So this would be part of maintenance as well, then?
Yeah.
Okay. And I think I just wanted to emphasize, I think I really like M3, designate an urban forester within the city staff, and I think somewhere it also mentions city leadership. I think it's really important that all community plans that we have refer back to the urban forest plan, and we integrate this urban forest plan with all the other plans, I mean, we started with a comprehensive plan, but even, when I was looking at some of the stormwater code, or even when we're doing the shoreline code, we all should be taking this into consideration as we go ahead. So thanks.
On M3, as I was reading the plan, it was my understanding community development, public works, and parks all had a part in trees, and you kind of outlined what those costs were and all that. But I was wondering how well they actually all work together in dealing with the trees, if there's what kind of improvement we might see with an urban forester. Would they be spearheading all three departments? Would they what does that look like? Has there been a thought process on that, or would that come next? Comes next. Great. Okay.
Yeah, that's something that can be, again, because this is the goal and objective, this would be, we would need to identify some potential actions around that, and maybe put some fence posts to define that a little bit more, and probably a lot more conversations around that as well.
Has there been work yet on the challenges right now presented by having three different departments dealing with the trees in the city, so that when we move to the next step, we have the data available?
I think a little bit, one of the ways I might describe it would be like in planting strategies. The Public Works Department may have some planting replacement work that they're doing, but they do it themselves because it's in their own little budget. And then the Parks Department has their strategies, and they do it themselves in their own little budget. And having a leadership person, bringing them together, again, would be optimize efficiency in the city for making these, the kind of decisions that have everybody in the different departments moving in the same direction.
Some of those budgets aren't so little. I'll wade into the deeper stuff here a little bit. I think that there's been a lot of talk in the past about the city having a full-time on-staff arborist, and there's different opinions about that. And I think that it seems to me that M3 may be suggesting that a little bit in softer language. I suspect when you present this to the council that will certainly be in their vision. And I think that when you talk about both that as well as the annual urban forestry operations budget, we really do get to exactly what Josh was suggesting, where we have to decide the value of this versus other things because we have limited financial resources, and we have to decide how to do that. So I would encourage that as these get developed further, we not try to dance around the subject too much. Let's deal with it head on to make sure that it's clear that if we have differences of opinion about hiring staff, that we deal with those so that we don't spin our wheels in this topic. If it's going to be, as it sort of suggests, somebody within the staff, I think if any of this is going to work, which I think Josh kind of suggested too, you need, or Eric, I don't recall, but you need to have someone who's responsible. When you have too much responsibility spread out in any organization, it doesn't work very well. So this is a bit of a new thing for our city and for the staff, and so we need to make sure that somebody has responsibility for whatever gets created in terms of implementation strategies. And if that means we hire somebody and everybody decides to do that, that's fine. But if not, let's not be soft about deciding who's responsible and how that responsibility looks.
And that's why we proposed an interdepartmental working team as the goal, just so that in absence of having a senior person, a decision maker, urban forester, that there would be a routine small group coming together to say, this is what urban forest projects we're working on. These are what we're working on. Hey, how can we partner up? And I'm just thinking like City of Seattle, I've been consulting with them, and they have 9 different departments that come together for a working team, and they experience a lot of successes that way because they talk about their individual projects and find ways to work together to really get more value out of them.
I will say that I'm absolutely certain that whatever the city of Seattle does, we will do it much better.
Well, I think it's interesting that we are kind of plowing some fresh ground on this. We're going to maybe even, you might be able to see other planning commission meetings in neighboring cities, and they're looking at what we're doing as an example of what they could do, which I think is pretty neat. When we were first starting on all this tree retention stuff 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, it seems like so long ago, yet not so. I was doing some research and found that the city of Vancouver, Washington was able to divert a significant portion of their public works funding to their urban forest in recognition of the stormwater benefits. So I think that this is going to kind of mix up some of the previous ways people have thought about funding. And when we start looking at the carbon sequestration and some of these other stormwater benefits from individual trees, and you start seeing how there's millions of dollars being saved by that, it makes you look at them differently, and it's going to start changing the equations on all these things, and I think that's exciting for sure, but it's not going to come without some challenges, for sure.
Okay, great. Okay, so finishing up with municipal operations, goal 5. Enhance processes for tree planting and plant salvage. Objectives include developing a staging site for the city to receive and care for trees and other plants, acquire a watering truck, manage warranties from nurseries, and provide ongoing training for volunteers and staff. Goal 6, review tree ordinances every 5 to 10 years. Objectives include evaluating removal and replacement ratios, preserve existing exemptions for utilities, develop incentives for development projects, consider revisions to tree removal and replacement requirements, evaluate exceptions for tree removal permits, provide options for private property tree management plans, and develop flexibility for coniferous tree replacement requirements. This is a big one.
I really like this.
Yeah.
I liked goal C and D, and I think it might even be F. I think when it kind of speaks to water quality benefits of trees, that this could be sold maybe as a benefit to developers to leave more trees in place, and that maybe they would have to spend less money on building and developing stormwater facilities on site. So that maybe just kind of what Eric was saying about thinking about things a little differently, that if we thought about our trees in a more different way, that just as our giant plant that happens to grow out of the ground, that it provides a whole lot of benefits, a whole lot of economic and environmental benefits, that if we can reshape that conversation with the developer and say, if you leave X number of trees here, guess what then? Stormwater becomes a completely different conversation, and you're going to save X amount of money if you leave X amount of trees that you won't have to spend on building a stormwater facility on site. So I really liked this, and I'm glad that that was mentioned there. Thank you.
Sorry. So I'm really happy to see M5, which is to enhance process for tree planting and plant salvage. I just wanted to understand the current program maybe that the city has, because I know we have quite a few members in our audience who actually do that work day in and day out. And I think they had a salvage party just this weekend. But I wanted to see if we have an established program by the city already.
Well, what I heard this goal did come out of the stakeholder interviews. This was not this was definitely something that was a unique issue to Sammamish. And what I heard, I believe it was some of the folks in this room, was that the city doesn't have a watering truck, and so that's a challenge for tree planting programs. the staging site. There's a lot of people that are interested in plant salvage, but right now they're having to do it in their own backyards or in other creative ways. And for the city to take a proactive role in supporting a community that wants to plant trees, developing that sort of staging site. I thought I was at a meeting with somebody from the Parks Department was talking about a staging area already in the works, but I can't speak to that with
I think
any
that's part of the
authority.
Big Rock
Yeah, it's part of
Park
Big Rock
planning
Park.
process.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I would just suggest rewording the enhance, because enhance presumes that there is already a process in place and we want to, improve that. So I would like us to say this is going to be a new process, for the city, because for me, enhance means you have something in place and then you're just improving on it.
Oh, well,
So that is,
I have heard that the plant salvage efforts go on, that there's, when there's a development project that they...
but it's all done
but it's-
privately, right? I mean, it's done by private citizens.
Right, right. Well,
I believe our volunteer coordinator.
Okay, they do?
yes,
they-
that's right. That's
Okay,
right,
so
volunteer
it is done through the city then, and there's a program that
Yeah,
does
and
that.
I can follow up with more information
Okay.
on that, because to be honest, I can't, I've been out of parks for
Yes.
almost 2.5 years, and that information has been archived. So I will follow up and with that. I'm sure
That
we may
sounds
hear
fair.
some of that information during public comment as well.
Right, sounds good. And then on M6, I think it says, develop flexibility. So I just wanted to understand, what does that mean? What does develop flexibility mean?
well, that came back, was reported to us specifically in city code that coniferous trees planted have to be 8 feet in height. And what comes out of nurseries is maybe heavy or awkward, or it's not a practical number, that 8-foot number. And it may be better to visit something that, if the homeowner or the developer was to propose an alternative, there needs to be some flexibility in the code to say, okay, you're meeting the intent of that objective without being restricted to this 8-foot limitation. Where if it's 6.5 feet out of the nursery, it's still a good stock tree, but may not be of appropriate size.
So would that discretion be with the director? Would that be some sort of exception, or how would it look like?
Yeah.
I think that's something that we would need to, as a potential action, need to look and evaluate and see what would work best. So I think we just need to have further conversation, and a potential implementation strategy could be, hey, have further conversation about this and maybe do a little further research and see maybe what other cities are doing, or maybe a little bit more conversation with citizens and developers, so that that can properly influence how that code section is updated, if it looks like that's something that we should be doing.
Okay, thank you. Because I think there's always a fear that, some party might get away with not doing a good enough job, whereas certain people might be burdened with exactly, this, it has to be 8 feet. So I think we should leave as less loopholes as we can.
Okay.
So would like to discuss this more as we go through the implementation phase. Thank you.
I like on M5A, it touches on the importance of other plant materials besides just trees to the health of the urban forest. And I think that might need to be further pulled out, right? I think we'll all agree that it's not just the trees, it's all the understory that really does it. So, and this is really heavy on kind of trees, which I think that's the most obvious thing, but there's this supporting cast that we should also be considering. And then M6B, the exemptions for utilities, we touched on that a little bit, but I think when I say, when I read full-on exemption, just kind of have at it type of thing, it causes me a little worry. So, I mean, if we could, I don't know what kind of exemptions currently exist, and maybe they're not as kind of have at it as I'm thinking they might be, but maybe they are. So I think that might deserve a little more.
That one in particular came out from interviews with Sammamish Plateau Water. That they brought representatives to this conversation because they were concerned that they already have sites in plans in the works, and that if this UFMP restricts that it's going to add a lot of costs that, you know, they were already thinking ahead that there's going to be some community costs potentially through this UFMP. So they wanted to, this was our way of trying to acknowledge that that's another party involved in this plan.
Yeah, and I think maybe something with M6 B is that maybe we change preserve to consider, and so that we can further evaluate that and not be so, you know, directive in that objective. Maybe we need to change that language a little bit. So that would be something to think about as part of the public hearing and deliberation portion.
Because again, these are a list of kind of brain tickler, so to speak, to things to remember, to further explore later.
Exactly.
Right.
I have a question on a definition. M6C, development, incentives for development projects. Is a development project something that's in process, or could it be a homeowner that's changing something in their yard?
Yeah, both. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think that gets lost sometimes. Developer can be a bad word to some people, but we have to remember anytime you make a change to your property, you also fall under that definition.
And in hindsight, just in grammatically, it's usually a good idea to use a different word instead of using the same word twice in a sentence.
On M6G, can we get some historical context, not right now, but on the 8-foot height, why that might have been put in place originally? If we're looking at changing it, why it was there in the first place, what scientifically it has the 6-foot versus 8-foot requirement, so that when we go to make a decision, it's available?
Yeah, when I asked that during the interviews, I couldn't get nobody was really knew for sure where it came from. It just it worked its way into code, and so it was during the code development exercises. If some of you might know the answer.
So, to the best of your knowledge, there's no perfect reason, or the 8-foot might be there for any number of reasons, none of which necessarily.
Could it easily have been whoever was drafting the code had made some phone calls to nurseries and said, you know, this is a sufficient sized tree, and then it went from there.
Okay.
We may have some
historic
expert opinion. Okay.
The one answer I can provide tonight. So the 8-foot was the result of some pretty lengthy legislative review and debate, and a desire of our, at the time, our city council, trying to respond to some significant public comment that when you plant little saplings or, you know, small trees in the ground, they take a long time to grow up, right? So the council, I think, was going through that tree code process, trying to find a point where it was still realistic for your average property owner to be able to bring a tree onto the property to plant, but not completely vacate, you know, a sense of screening or privacy that came with trees that were possibly being removed for whatever reason. So that was where that came. Is 8 the right number? It was long debated with our city council at that time in 2015. But that's what we've been using for the last 3.5 years. So, and can certainly be subject to change.
And I think the important point for this plan, for the UFMP, is to make sure that the ordinances are a part of a cycle of routine revisions, because there's elements in the ordinances that are, you know, typically we know more about trees and we learn new things, and so you want to have a plan that also plans for review of ordinances, and so you kind of want to, you know, have this staggered, you know, review the plan, then review your ordinances, and then review the plan again, then review the, and on down the road you go.
I guess I wanted to follow up on that, just keep my voice going. There's also, I don't know if anybody else has ever worked in a sawmill before, but the 8-foot, as soon as I read that, I know why. That's kind of the shortest cant or piece of lumber you go through. They do cut down the 6 and 4s, but it's usually 8-foot logs that get to the different places. So somebody might have just couldn't let go of 8 feet.
Okay, fantastic. Let's go on to there we go. Community collaboration and engagement goals and objectives. So, starting with 1, maintain an engaging, user-friendly urban forestry webpage. Objectives include creating a dashboard for tree-related questions and facts, enhancing the urban forest story map, and adding landing pages to support community interests. And before I actually go on to goal 2, we do recognize that the maps in the plan are hard to read. They are citywide, and sometimes it's zeroing in on where fragmentation is happening or where there's an opportunity plant may be hard. We do have the story map for our urban forest under the urban forest management page on our website. I encourage anyone who wants a closer look at those maps, who maybe wants to zero in on their parcel to see what information is there, to use that story map. And we do plan on keeping that after this project. We actually just talked about how do we keep that updated this afternoon. So I did want to point that out. But let's move on to goal 2. Develop outreach materials to encourage and educate on key topics. Objectives include developing an annual State of the Urban Forest report, defining successful public outreach methods, and partnering with other city departments and organizations to share information about information and outreach goals. Goal 3, pursue and maintain Tree City USA status. Objectives include creating a citizens tree board and ensuring annual urban forestry expenditures are above $2 per capita, and that is a requirement to gain that status. And then the goal 4 on this slide is elaborate and nurture partnerships with other organizations. The objective here is to collaborate and develop partnerships for streetscape tree replacement and improvements.
I just have a comment. I liked C1, 2, and 4. Again, going back to kind of this outreach to our privately held, where our urban forest is in private hands, where we're kind of reaching out and educating and kind of going to the email that we've received from a homeowner who's having a bit of a tough time maintaining trees on their property due to a lack of water. That this would be this is kind of like a case in point of being able to reach out to a homeowner who, and finding out their opinion about what's going on their land and how could we help them maintain the trees that they have and how can we help them troubleshoot what's going on there. So it would help to maintain our urban forest that's in private hands. So I think anything that we can do from the city level to help educate and support people who want to maintain their trees or are at a loss as to what to do because it's becoming too expensive, et cetera, but listening to their concerns and maybe coming up with a plan of maybe, as Eric was saying, it's maybe not always all about trees, but maybe we could help them come up with other plants that might be more suitable in that area if the trees aren't finding it difficult to survive in that area. So I like that we have a public outreach section in the plan, and I think it's really important that if we're really interested in maintaining our city canopy, that we have to involve part of the canopy that's on private land and do as much encouraging as we can to maintain as much of it as possible. So thank you.
Thanks. I think this probably is one of the most important pieces of the goals. I think community outreach, I think we all know in Sammamish people are very passionate about trees and there's a huge public involvement. So I really like this education piece to it too. I have gone through the story map. It's really easy to use. What I would also like to see is, we have other initiatives going on in the city. So for example, we have the Beaver Lake Management District. Can we add pages to that? Can we add links to, the projects that are done by King County? Because I think the requirements for urban forestry for that are going to be a little bit different than, for maybe like 228. And I think it would be good to get a good perspective on what different pockets we have. I think also on C4, if you go on 228, we have 3 high schools, we have a university, and I would like to see those educational institutions as a big part of this. We potentially have a new elementary school coming online, and I would like them to be a big part of, how we manage our urban forest. So institutions, I think, are going to be really important because I think, putting it into different buckets, how institutions, how commercial spaces deal with urban forest plan, how people who live in more secluded wooded areas, I think those are going to need different perspectives on how we implement this plan. So I'm really interested in seeing that. And I think the one part that, I don't know where, again, it'll fit, but I think thinking about regulations and enforcement, and a review of them is also an important part. And I think it should be a part of some of our goal in there, saying, how are we enforcing? I think that is one of the big complaints that we've seen from our citizens too is, how do you know we're enforcing the 35%, policy, or what are people, how they're planting the right trees? And I know it's been a challenge for the staff, maybe because you don't have an appointed person, or, you don't have a dedicated person. But I think putting that into the goal is really important to me, because then it also demands accountability from the city as well. So I would really like to see that put in somewhere in the goals. So thank you.
I love all the maps, and I hope I don't take from Mary's public comment that may be coming up, but I would add maybe the canopy health map. It talks about the canopy. It'd be interesting to know where in the city the canopy is healthiest and where it's not, and just as if that's doable. And I was wondering if, as I went through here, I thought of some existing regulation that changes to might be triggered by this, and I was wondering if you could come up with a list of those. The street tree list that was done a while back might need to be tweaked as a result of this, right? The tree retention code we talked about, maybe even the development regulations that we recently passed might be modified. And then if there's any on the street tree list, if there might be any preference on conifer versus deciduous, if based on some of these stormwater benefits or whatever, there's a lot of opportunity there, energy savings and things like that. So I guess those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mine will be real quick. I usually say I don't want to do editing, the spelling and that in the thing, but since I'm a little older than new, under 44%, do we want to change that to news article or new articles? I don't know. I wasn't there when the public said it, but I was hoping that old articles.
I think I can update this slide. Thank you. Especially in front before council. Thank you. Okay.
I just add on a comment that kind of tails with what Ritu just said is, I would really like to see a bit more teeth in some of this as we develop some implementation strategies. My perception, with absolutely no proof whatsoever, is that there are oftentimes trees which would otherwise require a permit before they're cut. They get cut down in neighborhoods all the time. And there's really a lack of understanding by most of the citizens of when they're required to get a permit, or maybe intentionally ignoring that. There's also the people that are doing the cutting, which frequently are probably, tree folks that should know better. Mm-hmm. And so I like the idea of making sure that we do an exceptional effort to make sure that people understand what the code says and what the requirements are, and then figuring out a way, and I don't have a great idea at the moment, but to do some more enforcement. I know that there's some discussion in the plan about requiring that people that do tree work in the city have certain certifications. That's good. But also making sure that, when people choose to cut down a tree, if they do it in offense of the requirements in the ordinance, that there's a consequence sometimes. And also when people do it the right way, that we encourage and help them when it's appropriate to do the right thing. Because if all you ever do is make it difficult for people to do the right thing, eventually everybody will do the wrong thing. So I'd like to make sure that those things get folded in there so that there's some ability for the city to actually make this real and protect some of the trees that should be protected or provide alternatives or whatever, rather than just creating a whole bunch more language that nobody actually can pay attention to because there's no staff available or whatever the reasons are.
Right, like a postcard, just a postcard that goes to every citizen that is just about the tree retention. I think that that'd be very helpful. I think that there are a lot of people that don't necessarily know, even though there were some percentages in here about the amount of people that are aware of the regulations. I don't know that, they may be aware that there are regulations, but I don't know that they're aware of the regulations, and that might be a sticking point there. Because, you know, I've recently seen where there was a bunch of trees topped, and it was obviously for some view preservation of some sort, but that's illegal in our tree ordinance. So I don't know if people really know as much as we think they know.
And we have an ever-increasing number of people moving. Right. So the new people need to be educated initially too, so yeah.
I think one of the fun parts of having that canopy, urban tree canopy analysis in GIS, is that you could overlay that with parcels and have a targeted mailer out to specific parcels saying, hey, you know, so you're not sending the mailer out to somebody who doesn't have a tree, you're sending it out to someone who does. You know, there's all that potential in there.
You could even congratulate them or encourage them or whatever,
yeah,
and make a game out of it, and then pretty soon everyone's competing about how much canopy cover they can have on their property or something.
That might get a little big brother-ish. We might get some
Yeah, you want to use caution, but yes, that's
we know what you're doing.
That UTC is data that can be overlaid with any other mapping data in the city. So that's why you talk about getting involved with emergency management and everybody else. You know, to say, okay, here's the areas to work.
Okay. If there isn't any other questions, I do have one more slide, and I do want to be able to give some time, because it looks like we have a good group here for public comment. The last two goals under community collaboration and engagement, number 5 is establish an arborist business license. These objectives include identifying the number of companies doing arboriculture business in the city, ensuring all tree work follows tree care standards, hosting learning forums, and creating provisions to revoke business licenses in cases of poor arboricultural practices and disregarding city regulations. And the last goal here is 6, develop a wood reuse recycle program. Objectives include collaborating with end users, improve and encourage communication of wood waste utilization and plant salvage opportunities, designate areas as free wood chip sites, incorporate and utilize wood chip waste in city parks and open spaces.
I'm sorry. I'm kind of caught up in all this. So I try not to do negative, and I don't know how I can get out of this but I attended a couple of seminars on urban forest management, and remember my little history in the sawmill. I mentioned to the people there, I said, well, yeah, if somebody cuts their tree down, wouldn't it be good or better if an efficient way of disposing of that or reusing it, repurposing that? I didn't get much playback on it. The people just didn't seem to think that was a good idea. So I'm turning that over. Maybe, you know, I'd be willing to head up a little sawmill in the middle of town. That's the best I can do to get on a positive.
Just historically, it's challenging. The recycling program. I mean, I heard it from David Goodman. You know, to take wood chips and use them in parks. There's specific designated types of chips that go into playgrounds. You can't just use any wood chips, and So there's, we've definitely included this in the plan because it's important to think of that full life cycle of a tree, and that even after the tree is removed, that its parts have value. And so it's more just, this is again an opportunity for the city to be a leader and presenting opportunities for artists and craftsmen to maybe be able to connect with a homeowner who knows that they're taking down a large Douglas fir, and they can come out and they can eyeball it and maybe get engaged and turn it into tables and chairs and what have you.
I think it'd be wonderful. I mean, we've got all kinds of board feet of Douglas fir right above our heads, and if that could be, in some public building that could be harvested from our own sustainable forest.
Arborists have a hard time because you want to get an 8-foot wood length, but if the tree is in between a couple of homes, they have to piece it out into smaller pieces, and so that's why you kind of hear that challenge around this. But it's definitely something worth working on.
Okay. Oops, there we go here. Okay, so next step. So that's the conclusion of a review of the goals and objectives. And thank you again for all your questions and your feedback. Where we would go from here is that on June 20th, the Planning Commission will hold a public hearing and deliberate on the draft Urban Forest Management Plan. This is an opportunity for you to take the information you've received tonight, as well as hearing from the public and taking a look at those goals and objectives and fine-tuning, maybe adding some clarifying language, or however you see fit to update those or amend those so that we can get that approval by the Planning Commission and then send that recommendation to City Council. So on June 20th, like I said, we'll open and close the public hearing. You will deliberate on the changes that you would like staff to incorporate into the goals and policy, or goals and objectives. We'll continue that deliberation on July 18th, and we'll have Planning Commission vote on a final recommendation to City Council. And also I shouldn't forget that on July 18th, we also hold another public hearing, but this is specifically for the comprehensive plan amendment that incorporates the Urban Forest Management Plan. It is a dynamic reference update. It's very minimal, but we will hold that public hearing. You'll deliberate and make a recommendation on the comp plan amendment as well. Between July and the fall of 2019, before this goes to City Council, we'll do an update to the plan incorporating all your changes as voted on by the Planning Commission to recommend to City Council. And in the fall of 2019, we will present the Planning Commission's recommended Urban Forest Management Plan for their review and, fingers crossed, approval. And in early 2020, very early 2020, we will also do a overall comprehensive plan amendment, including the urban forest plan and the housing strategy, to get that yearly amendment adopted. And then on the heels of all of this, in early 2020, we'll start working on those implementation strategies, which I know everyone is very eager to get going on, because that's where we really see the effects of this plan. And so I do want to thank you for your patience. I know all of us have ideas and solutions on how this can get implemented, and to hold that back and focus on just those goals and policies is very helpful. So a lot to consider in the next month, and of course we want to hear from our public. So
Thanks, Kelly. I am very excited that we have folks here who might be considering making public comment, because for the Planning Commission, that's always the exciting thing. Seems like we usually work alone. However, I would like to give the commission a chance to, being respectful of the time, take a few minutes, and if people have a few high-level comments about the overall plan, I'd encourage you to recognize that this is like fourth iteration and there's a lot of work that's been done, but I still think it's probably appropriate if there's a few questions to ask right now without getting too far into the weeds, which seems like an appropriate colloquialism for this particular plan. But we could spend a few minutes with sort of generalized comments. So if you have some generalized questions or comments, let's do that.
I have one. I was reading this the last couple days, and I'm concerned that I want to make sure that there's some information in the plan that covers some of our extended urban forest wildfire prevention strategies, so that some of our parks that have acreage of forest are properly cared for, thinned, and all that kind of thing. Is that part of it?
Actually, yes, that's an addition from the last time the Planning Commission, Parks Commission, and City Council reviewed the plan back in the fall, is we did include a brief description in the plan addressing wildfire planning, community planning. As we all know, it's getting a lot warmer and a lot drier in our summers, and this is something that I think is on a lot of people's minds, especially after last summer and the summer before the Paradise and campfires. So we felt it was really important. This also aligns with one of the work items council identified late last year, that we need to start having this discussion. So we took the lead and added a description, and we did add an objective saying that, hey, we need to further study this, and that there needs to be some implementation actions around wildfire community planning. And so, yes,
Great,
thank you
thanks.
for bringing that up, because I did forget to mention that.
The only other question I had is concerning the citizens letter that I think we all have a copy of. I'm concerned with the number of apparently dead trees and the fire hazard with that also. And then the fairly interesting set of requirements for the citizen to replace it seems unreasonable to me in cost and time. And I was also looking for, I thought the city code said 1 tree for 1 tree, but she's saying 2. So I'm not sure where that came from, or is it 2 for 1 or whatever? I'm not sure, but.
I am more than happy to follow up on that,
Okay.
and to check in with our tree regulations to see what the replacement requirement is. I don't know that number off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just make a general comment. I think this is probably one of the most exciting plans for me to work on. It's really detailed. I like all the history and also the background that goes into this plan. I think it gives a historical perspective. I mean, you know, as a city, we are nearing 20 years, and this is the first time we'll have an urban forest plan. And as many of us know, you know, we come to Sammamish because we like the green areas, we like the parks, we like the natural areas. So preserving that is very important as we go ahead. And you know, looking at it on how we can really tackle different areas of this urban forest plan, that is what I'm really looking forward to. Yeah, kudos to, you know, the slides that you guys put together and all the work that's gone in. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to the next steps.
I think that when I look at this, I feel that it's really steeped in the community, and I think that it's, like Ratuja said, I mean, it seems like it's kind of really brings a face to the community. I think that it's something that the entire community can circle around. I think it's unlike any other plan that we've done in that regard. So I think it's very exciting, and I think you guys did a great job kind of pulling it all together and making it easily digestible and usable. So, and you know, graphically and all that good stuff. I mean, it's pleasing to the eye and without reading the words too. So thank you.
I'd like to add to that, because that is another point that I think should be touched on tonight. All the images in the plan are from the My Urban Forest photo contest that we held last year. And this is the first time we've held this type of contest, and knowing that we wanted to use those images in the plan, because we wanted to know what the urban forest meant to our community and to our citizens. Everything from pictures of trees to wildlife to snails and butterflies, and the most beautiful photos that we have in our system right now. We continue to use them, but it does make this plan a little more special because I feel like that visual element is personal. It is our community and what trees and the urban forest means to them. So thanks. I'm glad you commented on that because I agree.
Right, and I think it's almost like some strange way a community character document, you know, in addition to a urban forest management plan. So it's fun.
I just had one or two last comments. One of the things that anytime I'm reading anything new, and especially when the information is new to me, one of the things that always helps me is when I know what the intention behind something is. So I really appreciated at the very beginning, it was laid out the scope and purpose, and it was very clear as to what we're after here. So that really helped me work my way through the plan when I knew what the intention behind it was. So I was grateful for that. And I just had one or two other things. It always just strikes me when I'm driving around the city at a certain times of the year when there are utility companies out there and they're doing various maintenance to trees in the right of way, and they're kind of hacking limbs here and heads there. And I know it's all in the preservation of our electric system and all that kind of thing. But I just wondered if they could benefit from having a city arborist who would say, hang on, don't cut it like this, cut it like that, because you make it look really odd when you leave. You have a one-sided tree or a headless tree. So I liked that we were kind of thinking about an arborist in the city. I also love the mention of the emerald necklace and how that kind of ties all of that together, and how when we put something like the emerald necklace into a plan like this, it shows that it's not just, oh, the emerald necklace would be kind of a cute thing to do, but it actually has a very practical purpose, and it could help protect the edges of our urban forest. And so I find that I'm continually educated because this is not my strong suit, this subject, so I'm continually educated about why, even though some things are rather nice to do, they actually have very practical, real-life, sensible reasons for doing them too. And I think it's always useful to put both of those reasons out there, the nice and the aesthetic, because some of us, that's how we see the world, and for others, we see the world very practically, and they have to have, reasons behind it. And so if we can do that with all of those things, and we can kind of all then come together and push that same agenda forward. So I really liked that. So thank you.
I want to thank the staff and everyone who worked on this, the prior planning commissions before me. It kind of reflect, when I started to study getting on the planning commission, it was one of the documents I read, and I really appreciated, as a government document, it's wonderfully easy to read, and it's easy for me to sit up here and kind of nitpick at it and find flaws, but it's a really good document, and I'm excited to continue working on it, and so thank you very much.
I want to second that, but getting to Commission Member Lewis's comment about I just read a couple articles on forest fire prevention and the whole thing, so I won't go there. But there's a couple times adaptive management is used within this document. And one of the things that's interesting that applied, and I'll just leave it at that because I read it, older trees have more fire-resistant bark than new saplings. So sometimes they will go out and they will remove the younger trees, which you start thinking about that, but that's adaptive management and hopefully prevention of fires and things. So,
three things. First, I want to vote for the picture on page 56 as my favorite. How can you complain about a plan that has that little guy in it? Two overarching things I would suggest. One we've talked about previously and didn't hear it tonight, and that is I've always had a question about how we fit into our neighbors and what our neighbors are doing, and whether that needs to be in the plan or not, I'm not certain, but I do think that understanding a bit about Bellevue, and more so about Redmond and Issaquah, we had actually talked about cheating off their paper, right? I mean, I'd like to know what they're doing, if they have good ideas, what's worked, what hasn't, if they're not doing anything. We certainly down on the south end are very interlocked with Issaquah, and so we can have certain policies and requirements, and then across somebody's fence, it's something different. At least a level of awareness about that seems like it would be appropriate for staff and for the community at some degree, to some degree. The other one is a thought that I've been sitting here listening to some of the other comments and thinking about it. I wonder, again, maybe not perhaps part of the plan, but I feel like we're grasping in the dark sometimes because we don't have a good list of what our existing related tree ordinances are right now. I don't like the tree ordinances that are kind of tied to our tree management within the city. You know, we have tree retention policies for development, but what other things are there? Maybe there's a much less than I think. I'm not sure. I think it would be useful as this conversation proceeds to have somebody extract out the pieces and parts that are in our code right now and on our requirements, so that when we talk about that, we can see in terms of what do we have. We talked a lot about our resource side of what do we have, but what do we also have already within our requirements? I think that would be a useful piece of information. And again, you know, maybe that drives an action item that says we need to change this, or maybe it says we have something already and that works and we just need to reference it. But I don't think we should continue to kind of go blindly along in the dark without knowing what we have required and what we have written down already. Otherwise, I think it's great. I echo all the comments up here. The font and the length of it this week meant that I couldn't quite get to the end. But I've read a lot of it before, and I think I would compliment Ian and the Davie Research Group on doing a great job. Now we just have to make sure that there's some follow through. And as I said earlier, we don't just create something, Jeff said this too, we don't just create something to feel good. We actually need to take some action. So I hope that we'll be able to do that. Rituja, did you have something?
I just was thinking, I think it's a really good point, consolidation of all the regulations that we have, and I thought that was part of one of the municipal goals. Is that not specifically called out? Or maybe it was when I was reading something else.
I think it's to revisit and assess the municipal ordinances. You know, there's that. But the plan does describe the goals or describe the ordinances. But what we don't do is actually just reiterate all the ordinances. We just sort of say this is the current status. So you might find if you drill down to, I think there's 1 or 2 pages in there that are just a high-level overview of the ordinances. But they're very non-judgmental. It's just this is what they are.
So I think it would be great to have an appendix of all the regulations that we have consolidated in one place and review them as part of our annual review.
And whether it gets appended to the plan or not, at least so that when we're talking about it, council's talking about it, Parks Department's talking about it, and debating what to do, there's an extract that shows all of those different pieces and parts.
So maybe like a dynamic reference to, I don't even have this on, a dynamic reference to, these are the code sections that exist in this today, so that when we do start working on those potential actions, that we were able to go back to the plan as a reference. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, so I think, for example, you know, like we talked about the tree retention for development, right? So maybe we might have some shoreline code which deals with, you know, trees on slopes, for example. So we might have some other regulation with that. So how do we consolidate all of it together in one place so we know, you know, where all our trees being referenced to and regulations around trees?
Okay, yes,
So,
I think
yeah,
that's
thanks.
For my part, I'm simpler minded. I'd like to just have, you know, a document with 4 or 5 pages that lists the paragraph that says tree retention policy is this, and there's the applicable things that to be aware of. Tree cutting permitting process is this reference, and here's the 2-sentence version of what it says. And there may be 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 other things. And I think having an awareness of what we already are trying to do should be an appropriate part of planning for what we should try to do differently.
Perfect. And I think those are great ideas that we should keep in the back of our head for June 20th, after the public hearing and deliberation, to direct staff of those ideas as a commission, so that we have very clear direction on what we bring to you on July 18th to, again, continue to deliberate and recommend, vote to recommend to the City Council, so then we can spend that time this summer getting that plan in shape and ready to go for council review.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here, Ian, and thank you, Kelly. Nice job. Let's move on to public comment. Sure.
I move to extend the meeting till 8:45.
Second?
It's been moved and seconded to extend the meeting to 8:45. All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Meeting's extended to 8:45. Okay, for public comment, I have 2 people on the list. Anyone that wants to make a public comment, you get 7 minutes. I'll just remind you to state your name and address as you start. That helps us out quite a bit. And first off, we have Cheryl.
Hello, my name is Cheryl Wagner. I live at 20035 Southeast 27th Place. I've lived in Sammamish for probably 30 years now, so I've seen lots of changes. I have 3 points I wanted to bring up tonight. One, thank you, Eric, for talking about the understory. We haven't really talked about that, and it's not mentioned in the plan about the understory with the trees. I'm a native plant steward, and it's really important that you have understory for the wildlife. Trees are also valuable too, but you can't forget the understory. So somehow I think that needs to be interwoven into that. 2, I wonder why Forterra is not mentioned. It's not mentioned about us becoming a green city. And I've always been really curious about that, why Sammamish doesn't do that. I saw that Issaquah just joined being a green city, so is Kirkland and so is Redmond, and using Forterra as a partner. And so that's my question to you all when you're thinking about that, whether we'd want to use this valuable resource. Because my third point, we can't do this alone. In terms of the urban forestry, I really believe that this document and this plan is really important to what our city is going to be like in the future and how we're going to be able to sustain our quality here on the plateau. And with the resources that we have currently with the maintenance department and the park planning, they're stretched already. So how can you ask them to take on a plan like this? I see that there's lots of things and objectives and goals that you want that plan to provide. What you need is an urban forester, a professional involved with this study, and an arborist on staff as the head parts of your team, and then involve the rest of the departments. But I can't imagine that you designate an urban forester among the staff that doesn't have that background. My brother's a forester, so I know what that means in terms of bringing that expertise to the ecosystem here, to the planning, working with the forest, and having somebody that really knows about urban forestry be involved. So I'd ask you to really recommend that to the City Council going forward. And I understand that there's lots of competing needs for money around here, but I think if you ask a lot of the residents, they would be willing to put forth $2. If you have 60,000 people or more, that's a lot of money. I mean, to be able to provide that service and that value to bring to us, because you can't do it piecemeal. I don't want it to see another plan up on the shelf that's not utilized, and it doesn't happen because no one has the time for it or the ability to really see it and understand it. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl, for your comments. Next is Mary. No, yeah, not Mary Wichter. Well, yeah, I mean, and anyone else is welcome to speak as well, so. Okay, so we'll take this, Mary.
I didn't sign up because there were so many people here. I figured you'd be running out of time. My name is Mary Wichter. I live at 408 208th Avenue Northeast in Sammamish. The great plan, great photos, really good work to get here, and excellent comment. And thank you, Commissioner O'Farrell and also Indy Puri for channeling a lot of things that I had been thinking about. Anyway, I am going to say that the development regulations, the stormwater code, the tree code, all need to kind of work together, and the city loves to do things one square at a time. So let me give you an example. You all know that there's many people in the audience who have been working on native plantings and doing things on HOA or private property, and the plantings are going, and it's really this cool thing. But when they leave, if that landowner, if the HOA decided that they wanted to do something different, or if they died, or if it got sold to somebody, you'd be stuck because you would have spent all that time and money and resources, but you wouldn't have any way to be able to have it protected. And Commissioner O'Farrell brought up, I believe on page 26, it talks about how 51% of all the canopy is owned privately, which means over half of it the city pretty much can't deal with. And I know that there's this gift of public funds, and they're always like, oh, we can't go on private people's property to do stuff, but you can. And here's an idea from stormwater. Back in 1992, 93, 94, there was something called a native growth protection easement. It's in King County Stormwater Code in 2016, which is the most recently adopted manual. And if you just search for native growth, it comes up 61 times, and about 31 of those, it actually gives you an example of covenants, maintenance, wording, and things. So what would happen is, let's say that there's a person who says, I want to do something with my property. I'm not necessarily developing things. I just want to work on getting rid of the blackberries and planting a few more trees and stuff. But it's really expensive, and it's helping the creek corridor here or something or other. So can the city help me? And the answer that you should have is yes, we can help you. We have technical staff, we have procedures, and we know the ANSI code for actually doing it. And when you do it, you tell the person, we'd like to get a native growth protection easement from you. Since it's private property, if they just give it to you for free, they're supposed to get paid for it. So they're giving you a value. You're doing the work, and then that will be recorded officially with the product, with the project, and with the property. So if that person dies, goes away, or if there's an error, the next person coming in and sees it. An example is Tlingit is the development which is down by the lake, by near Loops Thompson Road, below Tamarack. The native growth protection easement there was their open space. They're not allowed to stack stuff on the slopes. They're not allowed to cut stuff or do stuff. That is now owned by the city because when all the stormwater happened with Inglewood and Safeway getting built, the Army Corps of Engineers came in and put a lot of stuff in the creek. And the private landowner who it was hooked to, they're like, why am I owning this? This is like not something I should be owning. So it got turned over, but it's protected by a native growth protection easement. And if you search for native growth, either in the municipal code or comprehensive plan online, you will not find that it really exists or not. So you need to go back to the King County Code. So we have multiple things going on. And I believe on one of the pages, Mr. Scott had actually written up a summary of it. But like in clearing and grading, the clearing and grading permits aren't strong enough to actually help you with it. We're just talking about trees. We're not talking about understory plants and vegetation, and all that needs to work together. So the biggest thing I can tell you is what you're asking for at the end is something that's very worthwhile. There are things in code. There are things that can get implemented, and they need to start getting used. So one of the suggestions I have is he said do an update every 10 years. I think for the plan that might be okay. But I spent about half an hour searching. The prior tree ordinances are 2004, 2005, 2014, and 2015. So the current tree development regulations are almost 5 years old, 4 to 5 years old. It's about time to review those. So on page 69, so the citizen letter that I had forwarded for the lady who couldn't come tonight, and also on page 69 out of 81 in the packet online, you have quotations from individual landowners that say, hey, here's something wrong. It's not flexible. Like I've also sat when they had open houses for council. A guy would come in and goes, here's my property. It's all these trees. Here's my house. There's 4 trees around it. This tree we planted as a Christmas tree years ago. It's big now. It's messing with my garage door. It's messing with my utilities. I just want to take out that one tree, but I can't because what I have to do is do a whole arborist study of my entire parcel to take out this one tree. But developers can just go cut them all down. So it's really inflexible for the individual landowner who's trying to do the right thing, and we really need to fix that. So I would suggest, and our esteemed director, Jeff Thomas, I think is in charge of what goes on the work plan. It really is important that either this year or next year that the tree regulations come back, because you've been given a lot of input that we've been tossing everything in the urban forestry management plan, and it's finally coming forward, but it's really high at policy level, and there are things to do and try and change. And because you've got over 50% of it in private forest, you need to deal with that. The other thing I'll tell you is, and I talked with Mr. Scott about this last year, is the survey for the canopy coverage is only a leaf on. That's like in June, July, August when everything's fully green. There is not a leaf off canopy amount. If you go online to King County IMAP or the Sammamish property tool and you turn on the aerial for 2015 or 2017, 2017 is the full green thing. In 2015, it's the one aerial of all the images of this city that I think was taken during the winter time, because you can see the sticks and the trees, and you can actually see that visually. And I would just say, if we have a 48% canopy in general, and 51% is evergreen and 49% are deciduous trees, that means you really only have about 24% in the wintertime, so your stormwater control isn't as big. And if you lost those trees, or if they changed, or if the private areas changed, it would be a bad thing. Also, maybe the conifer trees count for, I don't know, 2/3 of the canopy. You're still at only 32%, so you can kind of play with those numbers. And I don't want to keep going because there might be other people that want to talk, but I have just a number of little things to write up on. I don't have time to write it up for about a week. But the biggest thing I can tell you is there are things in stormwater code, and it's King County code from native growth protection area easements, which just totally makes sense. People, I'm sure, would be willing to do them. It's the right thing to do. It's in the code already, and then you can enhance it or change it. And it came back from 1990 and before. The Growth Management Act started in 1990. So anyway, just wanted to give you that. Read thousands of pages of code, and that just popped into my head a long time ago. Why aren't they requesting these, getting these, and having these? Because it sure seems like the right thing to do, and then you can work with the private individuals. Thanks.
Thank you for your comments, Mary. And thank you for reminding me to use the honorific esteemed director, Jeff Thomas. Maybe that'll get me a little bit more credit. Okay, who else would like to make public comment this evening? Paul?
I was doing ladies first. Hello there, planning commissioners. My name is Paul Stickney. I'm at 22626 Northeast Englewood Hill Road. Sort of a smorgasbord and a little bit of an ad lib from what I've heard this evening. Real good meeting, real good urban forestry plan. And for some of the newer commissioners, just a little bit of context on where I'm coming from. I went to University of Montana in the 70s and was a graduate of the forestry school. So I have a Bachelor of Science in Resource Conservation and also a major in sociology, because way back then I knew what's important is nature and the people. So it is a good balancing act of those two things. On the smorgasbord, I notice in the plan it talks about a 48% tree canopy coverage in 2015. Don't know if there can be any more current numbers, but it may be interesting to have one with the subdivisions that have happened subsequently. Also, I agree with Commissioner's statements that peer cities that are more forestry oriented, I agree. Potentially Mercer Island, Issaquah, Redmond. I think it would be interesting in the plan for people to see the context of how Sammamish compares to those cities and what are those cities' goals for increasing their canopy and why, I think is interesting. I looked in the plan and may have not seen it, but I saw the ceiling for canopies 60%. It might be interesting to have a little explanation of why. How come it's not 65? How come it's not 70? How come it's not 58? Why is 60%. It doesn't have to be a long book, just what's the ceiling and why. And I think it would be interesting for the professional consultants and peer cities to the chair's statement to talk about the pros and cons and recommendations from an informed professional level. If Sammamish is at 48 and 60 is the ceiling, what are the pros and cons of meeting maybe a few different targets in that range? Is it in the city's interest to achieve 60 or 55 or 53, and why? I think having their recommendations on what the end game target is of that maximum 60 for the council and planning commission and the public to consider could be interesting. On page 25 of the plan, or 31 of 61, I think it would be really helpful to put percentages next to the acreages. And there are 5 categories on that page: R1 to R4, R6 to R8, R12 to 18, the other centers, and town centers. I ran some math, and the R1 to R8 makes up 95.5% of the land area in the city, and the R12 and higher and the 2 centers makes up about 4.5%. And just as an example only, and one person's opinion only, I think if the city had very strong urban forestry goals and plans that, let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, for sake of just an example, using a factor, if the city implements regulations maybe in the 8 to 9 range on a scale of 10 on the 95% of the property, and maybe a 5 or a 6 on the 4 or 5, where there are other competing uses, as was talked about tonight, as housing over time and different things, and stormwater infiltration. So do the same standards apply to everything, or should the standards be a little bit altered for 95% of the land area and 5% where there are other goals and objectives? The 2 scary things to me, and I've been hearing it a lot lately at a lot of meetings, is wildfire. You've already talked about that. I think the overall goal there, the only 2 cents I have, is try to figure out, if it happens, how to make it less worse. How do you deal with it? Because it is a character issue. You'd hate to think about. I thought about that this summer. Man, if that happened in Sammamish, what happened in California, it'd just be horrible. So I think that rises more to the higher order of magnitude to figure out some planning on that sooner than later. And then also, and I've said this several times over the years, and I think it should be in here, it's not important today, but in 100 years it will be, and in 200 years. What happens when the trees get really big? I agree with, Commissioner Crandall that they are fire resistant, but I'm talking about space between houses when the trees reach a 3 to 4 foot size. It's just something to think about. That's not a high priority. I think that's a further out issue. Last couple things. I think it was really good to talk about other values in the city, and 2 of the commissioners tonight had good conversation about how those values will compare on large-scale topics, overarching topics. That's up to City Council. But since I'm in real estate, I've thought of a few things that I've learned about over trees over time on site-specific issues, just to toss these out for top-of-mind thinking in a urban forestry plan. Some people like sunlight over dark and shade. Some people have a fear of trees or limbs that fall. Some people just don't like to pick up the leaves and all the needles, and it's not just a little bit, okay? Now, again, I'm talking about other pros and cons here, okay? A couple other things I've observed are critters. I'll only mention raccoons, but there are other things that like to climb on trees and get on houses and get into your house that aren't as much fun. Usability of a yard. creating a ADU or not. So these are just a few topics that can go into the yin and yang of where to set standards.
Thank you for your comments, Paul. Would anybody else like to make public comment this evening?
Prior to that, should we extend another 35 seconds? Or, oh, no pressure.
Sure.
Another, you pick a number.
Go ahead, move to extend to 9.
Till 9.
Second.
Midnight.
Moved and second to extend till 9. All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Okay, we're extended till 9.
Thank you. Hi, Karen Herring, 23684 Southeast 32nd. I like this plan. Thank you for doing that. It was a great job. And let's see, Paul talked about critters. I have squirrels that go up into the trees, and they like to throw things at you. So, but you know what? I like them anyway. I want to talk about trees on slopes. They're so important. Let's see, I'm watching my neighborhood, my actual neighbor cut trees down, and it's frightening. So I live in a critical area. I really depend on trees for the water that comes down the slope into our yard and into the Laughing Jacobs Creek, which I steward. The other thing I wanted to mention was when trees are cut, the bits we can keep, those are great for wildlife. There are snags, the limbs and such can be left around because there's life in those dead trees too. And the other thing, the last thing I think is for you to know there are such resources out in the county where we can go get trees pretty cheap. They may be bare root, they may be tiny, but we get those. Our stewards took them into the parks this year and made a just wonderful new wildlife habitat. And we're here for you to do that. So just reach out back and thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Karen. Anyone else? You get 7 minutes either way, but sure.
Hi, I'm Mary Johnson. I live at 1429 212th Avenue Northeast. And I think the report is a great start. And obviously, there's been a lot of hard work done on it. That's obvious, and a lot to digest. One thing I keyed in on that I think is very important, and I don't think I have the wording right here, is something about establishing an arborist business license and determining number of companies doing business in landscaping and arboriculture. I think this is a very key, important endeavor to work on because in the neighborhood, I've seen arborists that are just don't really know anything about trees or in fact, on the next door neighbor's site this morning, someone wrote in and said their arborist didn't know why the cedar trees were dying. And that's pretty obvious to most all of us that they're dying because of the drought. And up the street from me, 4 trees were taken down. And I talked to the arborist, and I asked him, first of all, if there was a permit on the property, and yes, there was a permit. But I said, well, why are you taking these trees down? And he pointed around to all the trees, the Doug fir, and said, well, every single tree in Sammamish is dying, so that's why I'm taking these trees down. And I was just aghast at that. I mean, how incompetent could that be? And I said, well, what are you recommending that people replant with? And he said, Western red cedar. And of course, Western red cedars are not a good replacement tree because they're dying of the drought, because of the long, hot, dry summers we're having. So my point is that we should be encouraging homeowners to be using consulting arborists on their properties. This person obviously may be good at cutting trees down, but he obviously does not know much background in trees in general. So I think that's a very important topic to pursue. And one other real quick thing is the idea of carbon sequestration. this is a very controversial topic right now, and much beyond the knowledge level, I think, of most of us here. But I wonder, because the big leaf maple and the Doug fir are sequestering the most carbon, when those, and we're losing a lot of those trees to development, I'm wondering how many street trees, if we're not replacing with those trees because they take an enormous amount of time to grow big and sequester, how many will it take to equal one, for instance, one Doug fir for carbon sequestration? So I think a lot more, we need to really be doing a lot more research into that for best practices. And I don't have any answers, but it's just a couple things that jumped out at me. So that's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary. I'm really glad you changed your mind and decided to make some public comment.
Just quickly, Sharon Steinbus, 24933 Southeast 14th Street, Sammamish. Good plan, great vision for a green Sammamish in the future. I heard you asking what are other cities doing, and I just wanted to repeat what Cheryl Wagner said, and that is to encourage you to consider reaching out to Forterra. There are some 14 cities in the area that have entered into this green city partnerships with Forterra, Issaquah most recently, but our neighbor Redmond and Kirkland also. So just wanted you to encourage doing that. I think they can be very helpful. One thing I noticed, they have goals similar to ours, including improve the quality of life and connections to nature, galvanize an informed and active community. Another one of their goals that I think is really important for us is to ensure long-term sustainable funding. I think that could be a very important to Sammamish. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Anyone else?
With the chair's permission, I'd have to check on it, but I think in Peter Wollen's book, The Hidden Life of Trees, he does do an analogy between what a conifer retention of carbon and what the other, how to equal that out. I'm doing that from memory. And the other thing is our current tree retention policy has a lot of specifications about leaving, especially in the wetlands. You're not supposed to cut a tree down there. It stays for those habitats and other things. So I'm glad the public brought those up. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, everyone. This has been an interesting topic that we've been excited to talk about. As we wrap up, esteemed Director Jeff Thomas, do you have anything for us before we end? No. Great. Can somebody move to adjourn, please?
I move to adjourn.
Second.
To adjourn. All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you.